I'm Tom Payton, director and publisher at Trinity University Press. Thanks for joining us today for a conversation with Julia Martin, co-author with Barry Lopez of Syntax of the River, The Pattern Which Connects. Also with us is environmental humanities professor Scott Slovic, as well as acclaimed writer, our friend and Barry Lopez's wife, Debra Gwartney. As a mission-driven, nonprofit cultural and educational publisher, we are committed to an evolving agenda of work that engages, questions, and brings us together productively, in person and online, to discuss the physical world around us and how it shapes us individually and as communities, and how we shape it. Barry Lopez had no illusions about the seriousness of our global crisis. Yet he also felt a deep conviction about the power of hope and the sources of renewal in the living world. Syntax of the River is an extended conversation spanning 3 days between Lopez and Martin, in which he explores what this juxtaposition means for him as a writer. Julia Martin is a professor of English at the University of Western Cape in South Africa. She is author of A Millimeter of Dust and The Black Ridge House, as well as collaborator with Gary Snyder on Nobody Home, which we were also honored to have published. Joining Julia today in this conversation is Scott Slovic. Scott is the University Distinguished Professor at the University of Idaho. He served as founding president of the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment and was the editor-in-chief of their journal for 25 years. He has written extensively about American and international environmental literature and eco-criticism, and he lives in Eugene, Oregon. Welcome, Julia and Scott, and thank you for being part of this discussion today. By the way, you can order Syntax of the River at tupress.org using the link in the chat screen, and you'll get a 20% discount using the promo code SOTR20, SOTR20 as in Syntax of the River. To get started, however, it's my pleasure to first welcome Debra Gwartney to share some thoughts with us. She is the author of numerous books, including Live Through This, A River of No Return, and I'm a Stranger Here Myself. And with Barry Lopez, she co-edited one of our best-selling books, the widely acclaimed Homegrown, A Guide to the American Landscape. Thank you for joining us, Debra, to join this discussion, and now we'll get started.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm just delighted to be part of this, and I love seeing your face there, Julia, so I can warmly congratulate you on this terrific book. I've heard about it from so many quarters already. It's doing that take on a life of its own thing already, and it's wonderful that it's out there and big and making lots of noise. And I'm excited for the book. I'm excited for the conversation between the two of you. You both spent considerable time, Julia and Scott, with Barry in conversation. And so you know how he thrived on a deep conversation. It was integral to his way of thinking, his way of being in the world. It always amazed me to stand there and watch him with one person or an auditorium of people. He had a way of taking us into one depth after the other seamlessly and just astonishingly. You know, it had really to do with his erudition and his intellect, his gifts, but he had a way of tapping into what makes us human like no one else. And you've really captured that on the page, Julia, and I thank you for that. I just want to also quickly say that I feel very fortunate that if I want to hear Barry's voice, I can tap into, or I can go to numerous recordings. He recorded many, many things over his years, and I can hear that baritone honey voice that I miss so much. I miss a lot about Barry, but boy, I miss that voice. But I have to say, Julia, that reading through your book, I really heard his voice. I could hear his inflections. I could see his gestures, the expressions on his face, that as you both know, that hit sit back, long pause that he was kind of his signature when he was speaking. Somehow you landed that in prose, and I just want to say how much I admire that. and that you were the two perfect people to talk about how to keep him alive in the world. So thank you. Thanks for having me here today.
Thanks so much, Debra. And also, I was going to add to that list of qualities of Barry's that you just mentioned, his laughter. And I was particularly charmed with the way the conversation that's recorded in Syntax of the River is punctuated by laughter periodically, even often in the midst of the deepest meditations and reflections. There's an eruption of laughter, and maybe we can get to that topic a little bit later in our conversation. Julia, I wanted to say, to echo Debra and say thank you to Tom and to everyone at Trinity University Press who's been responsible for helping to produce this beautiful new book. And thanks to everyone who's attending this virtual book launch. This is not only a conversation about the book, but a kind of launch of the book out into the world that we hope will give it wings and send it out to more and more readers. So we've conceived of this event, launch event, as a conversation, not an interview, not a dialogue, but a conversation that will likely include multiple voices and may veer off on occasional tangents, which is, I think, entirely in keeping with the conversational, organic nature of the very book that we're celebrating today. And still, we will end punctually at the top of the hour. So keep that in mind. One thing Tom did a good job of giving an overview of Julia's background and her work, but the thing about her previous book with Trinity University Press, with Gary Snyder, the poet and essayist Gary Snyder, is that too is billed as a conversation, but a conversation not necessarily based on in-person spoken conversation all the time, but on many years of correspondence that has a conversational aspect to it. So because this event is not only a dialogue between me and Julia, but an opportunity for other people who are attending to offer some questions and comments that you may have, let me mention that all of you who are in attendance are welcome to place your thoughts in the Q&A stream, which you should be able to access at the bottom of this screen. I don't think you'll be audible during the call, but if you type your remarks into the Q&A area, I'll try to refer to these occasionally during the course of the conversation. And my apologies in advance if I can't include all of your comments, or if I become so immersed in my discussion with Julia that I forget sometimes to check the Q&A box. So I'm going to make sure that that box is visible to me just in case some questions come in there. But Julia, good to see you. Welcome in the evening, your time in South Africa. And I wonder if we can begin our conversation about the book and related ideas, perhaps by asking you to lay the groundwork for your 2010 visit to Finn Rock and the recorded conversations that evolved into the book, perhaps by asking how you came to know Barry Lopez and what you were working on, what you hope to learn from Barry when you went to meet him at his home 13 years ago.
Thanks, Scott, and thank you, everybody. It's wonderful to be here, wonderful that the book exists. It was one of those meetings with Barry that feels significant in a life. I was at the ASLI conference, you were there too, Scott, 2005 in Eugene. I was there with Gary Snyder. He was reading poems and I was talking about them. And after the formal public event, Gary had a queue of people waiting to sign their books. And so I kind of hung around, and there was this man standing there with a beard and a silver bracelet and a silver buckle on his belt, and rather interesting looking. I didn't know anything too much about Barry Lopez, in fact, but we started talking, and within a few minutes, I realized he was waiting to speak to Gary and waiting till Gary was actually done. Within a few minutes, I realized this is one of a handful of people who's going to be a significant person in my life. And so we talked. He saw Gary later, and then Gary had to go off, and then we talked for the rest of the evening, I think. And after that, wrote letters, and I had the feeling, let us record a conversation together. Partly actually as a way of being able to spend some more time, just extended time with this extraordinary person. And I could get funding to go. I was going to see Gary as well, and Barry kept saying, I've got to finish this book, and it kept getting delayed and deferred, and finally 2010 he hadn't anywhere near finished the book, but he made time, and I was there in Finrock. And Debra, I think you'd gone to Portland, you weren't there, but he fetched me, and we had these 3 days of conversation. And by then I'd read everything. When I first met him, I hadn't read anything. In South Africa, he wasn't too well known, but I'd read a lot of stuff. But then spending the time with him was this, as Debra, you're saying, this extraordinary intensity of encounter with somebody, exhausting actually, exhilarating, enlightening. I had to go lie down kind of thing, but very, very wonderful.
Well, I was going to, building on that, thank you, Julia, building on that, I was going to ask you to speak a little bit more about what it was like to have a conversation with Barry. One of the things that I enjoyed about Syntax of the River is the way you provide some context with the general introduction, and then the introductions to each of the 3 main chapters, where you do set the context a bit. But perhaps you could elaborate a bit on that and talk a little bit more about the flow of the conversation and the feeling of having these intense, exhilarating and exhausting meetings of the mind with Barry. The meandering flow of your dialogue as recorded in the book is so different from a conventional interview. You were recording your voices and the other sounds around you, so you may have gone into the experience thinking of it as a kind of interview. But at what point did you abandon the idea of an interview and relax into the looser format of a conversation?
Yeah, the person who typed it said, the sound of the river is flowing throughout, which was just a wonderful way of saying what was happening, how the conversation was situated, really. And I had questions, obviously, but I think the first question he took maybe 15 minutes to answer. He just spoke unrelentingly. So I realized, okay, this is not a back and forth. This is something else. And then the other participants in the conversation were herons or mergansers, birds that would come flying by, and the whole intellectual thing that we were discussing would pause, and he'd tell me about the bird. And gradually I realized this is the point, actually. The point is not that he and I are sitting and discussing some ideas. That is the point, but the point is actually that the whole environment is participating in this encounter. And it will go wherever it goes. We pick it up maybe. And I think my role was partly to just sort of listen and nudge things, maybe provoke a little at times, but it was this wonderful recognition that the place itself was not only where we were situated, but what the utterance was coming out of the place and his reaction to it. And he was teaching me about things by pointing out the heron and the mergansers and the
Swallows.
The swallows, which came at the end, right at the end, which he saw as a sort of portent, actually, something wonderful.
Yeah.
I think you said, what's it like to have a conversation with him?
Yeah.
The sense of somebody for whom everything is intensely serious. He said, I like intense. I can only do intense, really. And yet the playfulness is utterly there. And you're saying it's funny at times. And you said you might like to talk about that. We can talk about that.
Yeah, in just a minute, I'd like to talk a little bit about the playfulness and the humor. But I'm interested even in the process of recording these several days of meandering kind of digressive conversations, and then deciding to edit these into a book. And
Yeah.
I've interviewed many people and have often published these in books, but I've usually tried to streamline the conversations, to focus them, to remove at least some of the extraneous conversation, and really zero in on the key points,
Yeah.
so as not to distress my reader. But
Yeah.
you retained the digressions, interruptions, references to sights and sounds, patterns of the river. When did you determine to do that in this particular book of conversations? And were there any particular strategies you used? And did you cut anything out? You surely, that you or the typist cut some things out, but you left other digressive material in. And how did you determine how to do that?
Yeah, so I suppose behind that is a question of why it was this 2010 and now it's 2023. You know, what happened? It got typed up and then I sent it to Barry and he wanted to edit it and he wanted to edit it, and then his book was taking a lot of time and then he became ill, and it became this ongoing conversation with him sort of actually feeling bad that he hadn't done it, and my saying the main point was to be with you, it's fine. But he was not able to edit it. But I think what he probably would have been more like what you're describing, actually, because I don't think it reads like what we expect a Barry Lopez book to be like, in the sense of this incredibly beautifully crafted work. You know, his writing is luminously beautifully crafted. We know that. Although he says in the thing, I don't have a poetic sensibility. I have a narrative, not a poetic sensibility. So yeah, at some point I thought, no, the point is, look, I did cut out some things. I can't now, they've sort of erased from my mind, but I cut out some things that didn't seem to take things forward. But at some point I realized this is the point. He says in the conversation something about being with traditional peoples. He's sometimes had this experience that people place themselves outside so they can watch what's going on, and what's happening becomes part of it. And I thought, well, isn't that his teaching to us, actually? Isn't that part of his, in a sense, transmission, what I'm learning from him? And so if I were to just turn it into a set of insights and kind of narrow it down, it would lose that. And then actually, of course, we're only, what you have here is a recorded text, and I was with him over 3 days. So there's all of that, which is in a sense informing it, but it's behind it. And I think you also see that towards the end, by the third day, it's a little bit more meandering, a little bit more sort of broken up. He's not, the first thing he does is talk for 15 minutes, and then it sort of becomes more interrupted. And then by the last day, it's even more like that, less crafted, maybe more relaxed. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. How many hours of recording did you have altogether to go through?
I think it's about, well, I think each was about 2 hours times 3, maybe. It felt longer. It's sort of one of these timeless, I can't remember because I gave it to a wonderful person who typed it. You know, I actually can't remember how long it was, but it was huge. It was exhausting.
Yeah, a couple hours of,
in the best way.
A couple hours of speech can easily result in 40 or 50 pages of single space typescript. So yeah. Can we talk a little bit about laughter? You know, most readers who are familiar with Barry's many books but have never had a chance to meet him in person, especially in an informal context, may think of him as a deep thinker and a poetic storyteller, but not as a humorist. A lot of his published work is not known for the lightheartedness of it, and yet during the course of the conversation recorded here, there are frequent funny stories and eruptions of laughter. And I felt this way when I first met Barry. Actually, you know, it was at a lunch, and I had been writing about Barry for years, and people like Barbara Rass, who the former director of Trinity University Press, and David Abram, the writer, philosopher, and magician, were at this small table at lunch, and Barry surprised me by telling funny stories throughout the lunch, antic stories of pranks and, you know, mischief performed during river trips and things like that. So I was startled by his actual comical personality, which is so different than the persona that's sometimes in his writing. What was it like to be in the presence of that sensibility and to move so swiftly back and forth between the depths of philosophical conversation and funny ideas that have cropped up during your talk?
It's just delightful, you know, just delightful. And I think every great teacher, or even good teacher or teacher that one knows, is funny as well, always playful, always able to be light. You know, the seriousness and the lightness are part of the same ease in the world, I think. You know, there's a sense of ease at being at ease. And so the you know, deeply serious, unflinchingly serious and playful somehow at the same time. It's such a wonderful combination, but it's what we see in some of the people that we revere most, I think, capacity to move. That's why such people love being with children or animals. I have a gorgeous picture of Barry with Mimsy, the cat, on his shoulder in the kitchen. You know, delightful. And I think one can, it's quite instructive actually for all of us who tend to be very serious, and seriousness is, of course, a great teaching, but it's not separate from the play.
Yeah. So it's almost an illusion to create the sense that someone is always serious all the time, and to basically to edit out the lightheartedness of the person. And for me, it's instructive that in this particular book, the playfulness has not been edited out. It remains there. It's part of the structure and the, you know, the life energy of the book.
And I don't know what he would have done with it. I mean, that would have been a conversation, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this idea of the pattern of the book, the structure, the unusual structure, the not the back and forth interview format, but the more conversational, meandering and mercurial aspect of the structure. It to me, it's implied in the very title of the book, syntax of the river, the pattern which connects, which immediately leads me as a reader to be thinking of language and nature and language. They're entangled somehow, and the intermixing of the playfulness along with the seriousness in the book is part of that syntax. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how Barry used syntax, the word syntax, repeatedly during your conversations, and then how you came up with the title of the book, and you know, what you think of as the broader implications of that title.
Yeah, it's from something he said, where he said, you know, talking about the river, it's not the, I can't remember the exact words, but it's the syntax that I think it's on the back of the book, somewhere. I can't see it. But it's the syntax you're after, not the separate entities, and the pattern of things. And so I think he was, you know, he might have described himself sometimes as a naturalist. He definitely wasn't a twitcher. He wasn't somebody going and counting up the number of species of one animal that he's seen. And so he's playing with the idea of syntax, the way words combine to make meaning in a sentence, which of course he was finely attuned to in his own work. I mean, the rhythm of the sentence is hugely important in his writing. So syntax was something that he thought about a lot and played with and experimented with. So when he's saying that about the river, I think he's saying the living interconnected pattern of this place is what it is. The river is not water. It's not a thing. It's a living interconnection. of which he, as the neighbor of the river for 50 years, is a participant, is a part of, it's part of his being in a sense. So, and yeah, you said language and nature. That the subtitle is from Gregory Bateson, the book Mind and Nature. It's from the late 70s. And he's asking, what is the pattern that connects, I don't know what it is, a crab to a lobster, and I think an orchid to pansy or something, and each of them to me and me to you. And he's in, so that term, that phrase became quite important in the ecology movement, I think. But it seemed to, I liked it because Barry talks about pattern a lot in the piece, in the conversation. He's interested in the interconnecting patterns of things. And maybe that's his core teaching.
Interconnecting patterns. There's a poem that I like very much by Patty Ann Rogers called Knot, K-N-O-T, which is about the way the human mind pulls things apart and then integrates them together. And in this poem, there are two stanzas. The first poem is all about disintegrating, separating, analyzing, noticing differences. And then the second stanza, the final stanza, is about the inevitability of a return toward appreciating the intersections, the points of connection, the relationships. And it implies to me that over time, we're more inclined to think about connection and relationship, but our initial reaction may be to separate, to say, I'm different from that. This phenomenon is different from that phenomenon. And I wonder whether there's something, as you were suggesting, about the many decades of Barry's relationship to this particular place, the Finn Rock area along the Mackenzie River in Oregon, that enabled him ultimately, around the time when you were talking with him, to be noticing these interconnections. And whether it's the duration of his relationship to the place that helped him to appreciate the interconnectedness of that particular place.
Yeah, I was thinking about today how all of us with our cell phones have become used to this object which someone's called a personal shrine, being an extension of our body or our mind. But that in Barry, who was very untechy, I mean, he would insisted on writing letters rather than emails until right up here. It's as though the river was part of him, or he was part of it. And I think that's seeped in and steeped in over the decades, that environment was part of his body, or he was part of its body, in the way that this thing has, in some sense, for many of us, become an extension of our body mind. For him, I think that place, as you're saying, over the decades, sort of sedimenting, perhaps, of knowledge. He describes elsewhere going every day just to look at the river, just to watch the river. And that kind of attentive listening and apprehension of the place, I think, just seeped into his being in a way that's very instructive.
Attentive listening, or attention more broadly, is one of the explicit themes in this book and in many of Barry's other writings, this notion of awareness. And in fact, in various places throughout his writings, he uses the term technique of awareness or techniques of awareness. This is one of the things that first attracted me to his writing. I was writing about him for my PhD dissertation shortly after Arctic Dreams had been published. And I had an entire chapter on Arctic dreams and awareness. And this continued to be an important theme, motif, idea, permeating all of his writing, I think, up through Horizon. And I'm wondering, though, if you could explain what you might have learned about awareness from that conversation with Barry, and by experiencing his patterns of attention during the actual time that you spent with him along the Mackenzie River. You've touched upon this already in some of your earlier comments, but I think if we could try to understand that explicitly in the context of awareness and attention, what the way he could attend deeply to something like the arrival of two mergansers settling on the water, and then shift back so quickly in mid-sentence almost to the idea that he was exploring in your verbal conversation. Were there any techniques of awareness that you recall from that visit, or that you've tried to include in this particular book?
When you say Arctic dreams, I think of those opening sentences and paragraphs and those at the beginning. It was utterly crystalline, astonishing demonstration of awareness. I think it's just extraordinary. So by the time I was spending this time with him, I'd read those things. But yeah, absolutely. He would, maybe I should say something about the context in which this conversation happened, because we weren't just sitting and recording things. This was only a few hours of what turned into text. There were other stuff, and that's part of where the awareness, I suppose, is demonstrated. So he took me on a drive out of Finrock into to see a particular waterfall and into a forest, and then he would slow the truck down to first gear, so we could actually walk and jump in or walk and stop it, and we were going as slowly as it possibly is to go, and looking at minutiae of the environment as we were going. There was no intellectual conversation happening. It was all utterly absorbed in the Douglas fir cones and the telling me about the mushrooms, and we saw a little martin, and so that was one enactment, I suppose, of the awareness. We're not talking now, we are talking, but we're talking about exactly what we're apprehending as it's arising. So there were 6 hours of that, uninterrupted 6 hours. And then I think I went back and lay down on my bed, and then we had the first, or one of the conversations. So there's the sense of a capacity to be, I think it's a lifetime's contemplation, actually, that he's demonstrating, to be very silent and very listening, or to be very voluble. You could do it all, to speak a lot or be very quiet, and to sort of pace himself around the situation very attentively. And then to give me a whole lot of books, like a whole lot of books about the animals and the plants, and that I must read before I see him tomorrow, kind of thing, which I obviously didn't quite, or read these articles. The sense, he describes himself as having a sort of inextinguishable curiosity and capacity to be awake for hours on something if that was what was needed. He said, I'm not like other people. And so you have a sense of a sort of burning energy of curiosity about the world and love of the world, love of all of this detail. Absolute. He said at some point, I'm enthralled by all of it. I just enthralled. So it's like being in the presence of a wonderful musician, where you sort of, you absorb some of that joy, I suppose, and seriousness.
I like that phrase you used regarding Barry's inextinguishable curiosity. I think I get the sense of a person who's very curious, who's wondering about things. He's not, even when he's holding forth on a subject for 15 minutes, he's exploring it. He doesn't know the answers, but he's curious enough to continue to push further and further on this particular subject. And I think the same thing may have been true about the minute visual phenomena around him all the time. Why are there 2 birds? Why are there 100 swallows at the end? It's that arrival of all these birds. It's a kind of a mystery. What are they doing here? What is the meaning of their presence? And this curiosity is, in a sense, the opposite of complacency. One of the risks, we might think, of prolonged residence in one particular location is it becomes normal. It sort of recedes into the background, and we take it for granted. But after some 50 years, or I guess it may have been more like 40 years at the time of, when you were visiting him, 40 years in residence in this place, it had not become boring and familiar. It was still mysterious and fresh and the source of ongoing curiosity. Is that what you think was the case?
I think so. And he, at some point, he describes himself as being like a boy, that there's the boy in him that has that curiosity. And I suppose it's almost like an innocence or a quality that one, again, with spiritual teachers, I think he was a spiritual teacher of some kind, who can relate beautifully to children because they can intuit a similar capacity for open curiosity. Maybe there's something of that.
Yeah. I wonder if we can talk a little bit, Julia, about craft and place, because that's occupies a central place literally in the book. It's the middle section, middle chapter is on craft. And I wonder if you can help us to focus on some of the especially important ideas about the writing life, how to develop a meaningful writing life, and also the craft of place-based nonfiction that you learned about from talking with Barry and that are present in various ways in this new book. I imagine that's one of the reasons why you went there to talk with him, because you yourself are a writer about place, and this was an opportunity to visit Barry in his place of all places, and maybe to talk a little bit about some of these professional matters. What did you glean from that aspect?
I am not aware of him having spoken so explicitly about what it is that he does in terms of the actual practice of writing. I'm sure he's done it in public discussions and so on, workshops, but anyway, for me it was wonderful as somebody who's trying to write to have this conversation with quite practical stuff, things like writing a complete draft and you're saying, I know this is not going to hold up. This is the first version, but not doing what most of us do, because at that stage and right to the end, he was typing on a typewriter. He wasn't doing the word processor thing that we all do. So we all go back and forth on the text. He would just type one draft and then keep going till the end and then correct it by hand and then retype and roll through about 5 times or however many times it needed. And just that extraordinary description I found very useful to think. It reminds me, but wow, if Barry could say, this is a bad first draft, but I'm going to come back, then I can also do that. And I don't have to keep trying to make it right as I go. Just keep going and then come back and come back. So that was one of the things that I found really just very practically useful. He talks about discipline, and he talks about hunger, that he has a great hunger. Those are qualities that people need. For me, the thing that I think is probably the thing that stands out from the whole encounter most, when I think of the text of it now, not so perhaps some of the, what's left for me of the text at its most central is what he says about vulnerability and writing. And it's just extraordinary. Can I read it? I marked it in my book. It's just a few little bit, because I thought I want to find a moment to read this, because it's extraordinary. I think many people have a notion of Barry's writing as, extremely beautiful and realized and all of that. But here he's talking about insecurity and naivety. And we spoke earlier about innocence in a sense, and that wanting to retain a quality of not knowing. I think you said earlier something about the curiosity is about not knowing and being sort of open to the not knowing. This is what he says. I mean, you can look at my notebooks and see I have no idea what I'm doing. I write things like that to myself. I'm in so far over my head. And now at the age of 65, I know, even though it's still very scary, that if I'm in over my head, that's where I'm supposed to be. and feeling lost and breaking down, actually breaking down in tears because I'm feeling the depth of my own stupidity. Maybe it won't work this time, but you know, I've gotten through it before, and you just have to keep going, push through the fear. I find this, you know, such a moving and wonderful thing. And I've come back to it in my own work often. If that's how he felt, then it's okay for me to feel like that. And I don't think everyone needs to write at the edge of, you know, the precipice like that all the time. I think Barry really pushed himself, but it's wonderfully instructive. And I've shared this with my students as well sometimes. So he says at the end of the book something like, I want to remain scared and uncertain.
Off balance
For the rest of my life. Wow. And
that's the concluding statement. That's the final.
Isn't it extraordinary? Yeah, and it really was the last thing he said. It's like, and I thought, yay, I'm going to leave it at that, because we don't want to rule a line under this. We want to keep it very open and very. He found that the fear and the uncertainty and the vulnerability and the naivety were precisely what gave him the charge to write as he did. So I don't know whether I learned, well, I certainly did learn things about place-based writing. I mean, this person who's absolutely embedded in the place, and definitely for my own work. But I think it's that the thing that I learned probably most from. It's okay. In fact, it's productive to not know.
This was actually where I was planning to end up in our conversation, partly because it was the final, the final statement. But it comes across almost as a kind of confessional aspect of this new book, that these moments where he reveals this sense of vulnerability, of being off balance, of not being the authority, but pushing into realms of mystery and being in over his head in these subjects, that I think is particularly surprising, you know, in these statements about his life as a writer. And my question for you, and you've already touched on this, is what you learned about risk-taking and adventure, physical adventure and intellectual adventure, artistic adventure, you could call it, from these conversations that you had over the course of several days. And, you know, I think you've already said it, it's okay to take risks, to not be in control of your material, to feel as if you're writing about something you have no business to be writing about, but to make of it what you can. And I think as a teacher, perhaps this is a particularly valuable thing for you to take to heart and to share with students who may themselves be feeling vulnerable and incapable of mastering whatever material it is they're trying to explore. But maybe the point is, no one is ever truly, if they're honest about it, truly a master of the material. Or if they're not only if they're honest, but if they're really pushing their limits and seriously exploring a serious subject, then how can they ever really master it?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. He says a couple of times, people think I'm this adventurer, I'm this explorer, but I'm not. I mean, not many of us go and butcher whales in the Arctic on the edge of the ice. He certainly, by most people's standards, did a lot of physical, geographical exploring things, adventuring things. So it's not ingenuous, but I mean, he said, I just did those things because I needed to, in order to find out what I needed to find out, something like that. But I think you're absolutely right. And of course, I think it's actually a sign of the quality of at easeness or confidence that he had in his own practice. You know, he describes writing as a practice, a praxis, a prayer. It's the sort of at-homeness in that practice that allows him to, in other words, in our terms, he was a master or is a master, but enables him to say, I don't know what I'm doing. It's the person who's much more insecure in an ordinary sense that has to pretend they're not. He knew what he was doing, and enough to be able to allow himself not to.
Yeah. Ironically or paradoxically, you have to have a certain level of confidence in order
Yes.
to be vulnerable.
Yes.
To open yourself to certain risks. We have a question related to this from audience member Fred Taylor, who says, I'm fascinated with Julia's reading about fear, vulnerability, and not knowing. How does this balance with the title of his other late work, Embrace Fearlessly the Burning World? Is there a kind of vulnerable fearlessness that Barry Lopez can be a guide for? Vulnerable fearlessness.
That's interesting way of putting it, Fred. I mean, I've been thinking about that with that book, which has arrived fairly recently here in South Africa, in my house. Yeah, I think he has to say it because the fear is there. You know, there is fear, and you can't pretend there isn't fear, but you need to work with this to discover the fearlessness. So I think it's, you know, he talks at some point about courage as well. The present state of our world demands astounding courage or fearlessness or earnestness or playfulness, all of those qualities that we've been seeing in him. But I think it's a lovely way of putting a sort of vulnerable fearlessness, that he wasn't a brave person who just go out and with his sword and sort of battle the world. He was terrified by what was happening. He said, I'm terrified. But in terms of, you know, our present eco-social political dispensation, but at the same time, one needs to discover the resources of fearlessness. You know, the warrior or whatever must know that fear in order to go beyond it, perhaps.
Yeah,
So
this kind of paradox, this sort of paradox of being vulnerable and fearless, of being comfortably at home and off balance while being at home. These seemingly incompatible tendencies or sensibilities seem to be important elements of Barry's sensibility. Even the fact that he is so well known as a writer who traveled. He once defined himself in an article many years ago as a writer who travels, as he was starting off his career, but also very much an emplaced writer who knew where his journals were kept. You know, they knew they were in the cottage. He knew they were, you know, where about this place in Finn Rock. But to go back and forth, this may be one of the reasons, one of the secrets to his ongoing curiosity, to the lack of complacency, the freshness of his relationship to the Mackenzie River area had something to do with the fact that he also punctuated his life with so many forays into distant parts of the world. That was part of the syntax of his life, so to speak.
Yeah. So it's home and away, and home and away, and home remains as this, you know, rich, deep, grounding presence. But and he describes in the conversation how, as when he goes away to speak publicly, he has to become increasingly serious and focused in order to make it worth people's time and so on. But yeah, the adventures and the home, they both require each other, I think.
Yeah.
And when you're saying that about I mean, isn't it the case that all of us paradox and contradiction and interaction and dialogue are what our life consists of? So at some point he says something like, you know, the river flows, there's a sort of flow, and then it hits a turbulence, and then it flows on again. And he draws an analogy with our psychic life, I think, that it's not actually consistently one thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to get back to that in just a moment, but I'm noticing that a few people in the Q&A are asking how to purchase the book with a discount. And I want to assure you that I'm going to get to that in my closing comments in a few minutes. We have roughly 10 minutes to go, and I was going to repeat the information about how to get the book before we leave you all. So don't worry, I'll get to that. But this idea of the mirroring, as you were suggesting, Julia, between the outer world and our inner life, or our language, it's related to an idea that various people have written about in relation to Barry's work. I'm thinking particularly of Barry's Australian friend, Mark Tredinnick, the scholar who wrote the book, The Land's Wild Music, also published by Trinity University Press, I should say. And this is the idea that there is a kind of, not just a mirroring, but a way in which our physical environment might insinuate itself into our imaginations, into our verbal styles, so that our voices reflect the places where we live. And Mark Tredinnick's book, The Land's Wild Music, gives various examples of that. But the idea, he says, comes specifically from Barry. Barry went to visit Mark in Australia and discussed the way the environment that he observed in Australia seemed related to the way he found Mark to be expressing himself. And likewise, Mark then turns the table in his chapter on Barry's work and in this book and says, you look at the very language, the structure of it, the vocabulary that Barry uses. It's like being in a dense forest. There's a kind of a richness, a dark profundity to it that is like walking through the woods along the Mackenzie River. And then the glints of light coming off the river are reflected in the insights and revelations in Barry's work. So so there's this mirroring back and forth, and I wonder whether and also in the passage in Syntax of the River, where there's some discussion of the patterns in language and the patterns in nature reflecting each other, there's a discussion about how, I think, Julia, this is in your introduction to maybe the craft section of the book, where you talk about the idea of Barry's apprenticing himself to an adept local person, not immediately knowing how to read a new landscape, but apprenticing himself to someone who knows the place, as a way of kind of bootstrapping himself into this familiarity and ability to read the place. And I wonder if, in a way, this is what you were doing during your 3 days with Barry, Barry being the adept person in that particular landscape, and you being the newcomer, the apprentice. So we're, in a way, maybe you were mirroring this process that Barry went through repeatedly in his life as he found local people to guide him into their places.
Yeah, that's interesting. At times I felt I was in one of those stories, one of those short stories where somebody finds themselves, because many of us think of Barry as Arctic dreams and nonfiction, but there are beautiful short stories as well. Somebody who finds themselves encountering an adept of some kind and then is sort of apprenticed to them, although the thing never concludes very conclusively. It's always open. It's always open. He actually said that to me at some point. I don't want to rule a line, but I think so. I mean, I think I was astonishingly lucky and privileged and grateful to have that time and to have that friendship over time with him. Mark Tredinnick was actually at that first meeting that we had in 2005 at ASDE. But yeah, I think he has definitely played that role then and in my life around that time, and some, before and after, of somebody who's a kind of mentor or teacher or adept.
Yeah. Well, and I think he also played this role. I'm sorry, Julia. I would say that he, in a way, he was playing this role in a kind of a secondary sense through his writing. introducing ourselves. If we read flexibly and imaginatively enough, we could use his writing about other places in the world in order to change the way we viewed our own places.
Yeah, Robert Macfarlane describes him in that way. I mean, he took a long time to actually meet him, but the work had that role for him in his own writing. I think.
Yeah, yeah. I see attendee Gail Clemens is saying that she read Arctic Dreams as a student of environmental science studies, and it led her to think about the idea that writers of nature and environmental topics need to have at least the concept of being in a home place, rooted in a love of place, maybe that place or place itself. And wonders if you have any thoughts particularly about that, that's something particularly important about the idea of a home place. And you being among the privileged people who actually spent time with Barry in his home place, did that occur to you at all?
Yeah, it was intensely private, actually, and personalized, and intensely his place. And then Debra moved there and became their place, and it transformed in some ways. But I'm sure that is a key to 50 years of writing, that he might not have had that grounding. He might not have been able to venture forth as boldly as he did if home had not been as present.
Yeah.
Geographically.
Yeah. Well, Julia, we're nearing the end of the hour. Is there anything else you'd like to say about the book project or the ideas presented in the book that we haven't covered? There's probably a lot more that you could say, but
there's probably lots.
Yeah.
I'll tell you one thing. When the book arrived, because it takes a long time to get here, and we thought the post is going to work, but they arrived. These beautifully produced. Thank you, Trinity University Press. I think really a lovely book. And I started reading it, and it felt so peaceful. It gave me a feeling of peace, and I can say that because my role is really just to nudge things along. It's his words, and I think it's a sort of gift of peace in a way. And the typist Jane at the time said, "This is a blessing." It was a blessing for her to have read this work, and there's something just the peace, if it is, that emerges from this lifetime of contemplative practice that we've been talking about in different ways. And yeah, it's this sort of time machine that is from some years ago. It's from before all sorts of things, and yes, it's a sort of gift of peace to the present. And I'm obviously grateful to Barry for that, and to Debra for thinking, let's do it.
Well, yeah, ironic. I share with you this sense of the peacefulness and the good-heartedness of the project, even if the final statement is about wanting to stay scared and off balance every day of your life.
It's fine. It's fine. It's like open.
Yeah.
I'm not going to. I don't know, and that's don't know is a beautiful way to end, actually.
Well, isn't this the state of mind we all need to acquire if we're to embrace fearlessly the burning world that we inhabit? Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, Julia, thank you so much for your work on this beautiful book and for sharing the time you spent talking with Barry about a dozen years ago with the rest of us by developing the transcript of your conversation into such a work of art. Thanks as well to Trinity University Press for supporting this project in many ways and for hosting today's book launch. I noticed too that part of the proceeds from sales of Syntax to the River will go to the Mackenzie River Trust for the care of Barry Lopez's house and lands along the Mackenzie River, which the trust now maintains. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone who's attended today's book launch. Remember, you can order Syntax of the River at TU Press, that is Trinity University Press.org, and get a 20% discount by using the promotional code SOTR, as in Syntax of the River, SOTR20, when you check out. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
And thank you, Scott, for being a lovely person to talk to. I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
I hope we can do this in person again sometime before long.
Yes, I miss you. Yes.
I miss you. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.